Okay, thank you everyone for joining me. My name is Dr. Gearóidín McEvoy. I am a researcher at the University of Birmingham, and I'm delighted today to be able to present to you some research that I've been doing. It's with a 2-year research project about legal recognition of sign languages in Ireland, in Finland, and all across the UK. And I'm delighted today to be able to present that research to you and present the findings of that research and the culmination of the 2-year research project. So I'm just going to share my screen. If you bear with me. And you ought to be able to see my screen now, I think. So what I'm going to present to you today is a roadmap for legal recognition of sign languages. And this is the University of Birmingham project and a project funded by the Marie Curie Actions Foundation from the European Commission. So if you can see from the next slide, so just a little bit about the project itself. This was the Legal Recognition of Sign Languages project that, as I said, I was doing for 2 years. So I'm going to be using the acronym LRSL to describe the project, just rather than saying the full name out, but it means the Legal Recognition of Sign Languages project. So as I said, a 3-country study. We looked at Ireland, all across the UK, so England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland, and in Finland. Interviewed deaf people and deaf people across the spectrum. So deaf people who were academics, who were health workers, activists, organizers, and just kind of regular deaf people who were interested in participating in this work. I did 28 interviews and 24 of those were in a signed language. So, it could have been BSL or ISL or Finnish Sign Language. All of the signed language interviews had interpreters, and 4 interviews were in spoken language where the participant actually asked to be interviewed in English. And I did those interviews between May and November of 2022, which seems like quite a while ago now. But it's been just over 2 years now that I've done most of the interviews. So just to break them down a little bit further, so in Ireland, there were 9 interviews conducted. So I did 9 interviews. And for context, for those of you who don't know, the ISL Act was passed in 2017. So it was a few years after the law was passed. And pivotally and importantly, it was right after the end of the pilot voucher scheme. So the voucher scheme is a system where people can apply to have basically ISL interpretation at an otherwise uninterpreted event. So if you interact with the education system or the legal system or the medical system, you have a right, and other systems also, you have a right to an interpreter to be provided for you. But if, for example, you wanted to, I don't know, go to a comedy gig, you could apply for an interpreter through this voucher scheme and have the interpreter come along and interpret the event for you. So you don't have to have sort of any specific reason for it. It can't be provided for by another service, which is often the case, as I said, with courts or medical services. So this scheme was piloted first in the pandemic, which kind of it sort of hampered its effectiveness for a while. But the pilot voucher scheme had just ended, and there was a lot of people who were quite angry about that having just ended and curious as to see whether it would come back at all. So as I said before, the reintroduction of the voucher scheme, it's now in place now. There are some problems with it, but it's back in place now. So the time when I did these interviews was in the middle of the time when the pilot scheme had ended before the reintroduction. And a lot of people in Ireland were very annoyed about that situation. I did 11 interviews in the UK, all across the UK, as I said, including Northern Ireland, where there is no sign language law in Northern Ireland. The other countries in the UK have various forms of sign language protection. And it was right after the passing of the BSL Act. I think the BSL Act passed in about I think it got royal assent in about May of 2022. So it was right around the time that I started doing these interviews. So it was really fresh in people's memories. And then for the Scottish people, the Scotland Act had passed back in 2015. So it's quite a while since the Act had come into force. And then in Finland, I did 7 interviews. In Finland, the Sign Language Act had passed in 2015. Again, quite a while since the Act had passed. And I did interviews with people who were Finland Sign Language users and Finland Swedish Sign Language users. I did 1 interview with the Finland Swedish Sign Language users. That is a very small community, so that's kind of understandable. Yeah. So some of the data findings, just very briefly. So education was a huge issue that people brought up, and I don't think that'll be a surprise to anyone who's familiar with the deaf community and anyone in the deaf community. This is very, very unsurprising, shall we say. So people complained about the quality of education. They complained about systemic problems, so problems with teacher training, the focus on disability as a mechanism for acquiring education, and the availability of teachers regionally. I know that was a big problem. For example, in Northern Ireland, keeping trained teachers in Northern Ireland was a big problem because it's a smaller area. The opportunities are maybe not necessarily there. A lot of the teachers were moving to London, and then there's maybe nobody to pick up the slack then in Northern Ireland. And I think that could be a problem that also applies to many rural parts of Ireland, Finland, and the UK in terms of hearing teachers also. It's a big problem. There was worry about spoken language acquisition, so children's ability to acquire spoken language, and the illusion of choice for families. So I'm going to present some data, but if you have Finland's a very large country. If you tell parents of a deaf child to say, well, you can send them to a deaf school or you can send them to a mainstream school, but the mainstream school is in Helsinki and you live in Lapland, that's not really a choice. Sorry, I beg your pardon. The deaf school is in Helsinki and you live in Lapland. That's not really a choice for you. And that was a big problem for people. And then the dwindling numbers of deaf schools, that's a problem across the board in the UK and in Finland in particular, where there are no more deaf schools. The deaf schools are all but dying out. So here's just some of the data. I won't spend too much on this because I know it's a large block of text, but Paul here talked about this idea of choice. If you have a 5-year-old child and they have to go to a boarding school that's far away and you only see them once every half term or midterm break, or you put them in a mainstream school, and that's not a choice. And I think he's right here. It's not a choice. And the BSL Act didn't do anything to change that. And that's, not necessarily a limitation of the Act itself. I understand that the Act was a private member's bill and it wasn't really able to do any of that, but it is for sure a limitation of the Act. So Otto then talked about in Finland. So some of the teachers may not be qualified to be a teacher of the deaf, to be able to make sure that students are able to achieve their potential. So it's not always the fault of the deaf child. And then Killian here talked about, you have to kind of persevere with each disability officer who's specifically talking about higher education. So you have to explain over and over again what provisions you require. And this is really tiring. This is something, again, I'm sure that many deaf people will have experience with that. You have to constantly fight for access with another person and explain to this person the realities of a deaf person, and then go on to the next person and do it again and again and again. And this can be really exhausting, particularly in a higher education context where you're also contending with, a lot of reading, exams, lectures, and it can be really tough that way too. So access to services, unsurprisingly, this came up. So consistent trouble accessing health service, a lot of phone-based services, particularly in Ireland. So if you needed, help, whatever it is, the addiction counselling, for example, in Ireland is very much focused on phone-based help. So you have to call the, whatever it is, the helpline in order to maybe find an appointment or find a group or whatever it is. And then that's very based around spoken language. There were some inappropriate interpreters or just unavailable interpreters. I was speaking to the interpreters earlier about, it was really hard to find interpreters for this event just because I needed so many. And obviously, I don't take preference. I'm not a deaf person, but it is hard to find interpreters. So we need more interpreters, and we need those interpreters to be properly paid and, have good working conditions. So people will want to become interpreters to encourage more people. Um, Access to arts and entertainment. And I think it's really important to point this out because very often we can get bogged down in saying that, well, maybe the courts are inaccessible or the medical systems are inaccessible or education. And those are all very important. But deaf people also have the same right to enjoy life in the same way that a hearing person does and go to the cinema and go to the theatre and go to a concert. And getting access to entertainment is very often left off the list of concerns when we talk about sign language laws. And it's extremely important. So deaf people wanted, better access to in-picture interpreting on TV, in cinema, subtitles, and closed captions. It's not that hard to provide those things. We look at Netflix now. You can turn on the subtitle track. We always have it on at my house because I have a small baby, so we have the volume very low. So the subtitles are very useful. But this is something that kind of only becomes popular when hearing people use it, and I really think it's particularly subtitles and closed captions. They're not hard to do, and they're not distracting. So there's no reason why we shouldn't provide those. Access to work is a big issue too. So people had difficulty finding employment. Systems for aiding work are not necessarily fit for purpose. If you in the UK, there's an access to work scheme where you're entitled to an interpreter. But if I'm working a shift job, and it starts at 4 a.m., am I going to have an interpreter for my job at that time? Like, is it feasible to have that? We talked about workplace safety. So I know I interviewed one person who had worked as on a construction-based work, and it just wasn't safe to have the interpreter there. So he was trying to be trained onto this particular type of machinery. And it was really unsafe to have the interpreter there because, for insurance purposes, it was dangerous. And he kind of felt that because he was requiring an interpreter, he maybe was passed up for a job because of the lack of safety. And then terminology problems, just in terms of like specialized work, and there not being appropriate terminology, and sort of having to make up terminology on the spot. Inadequate access to banking services. This came up repeatedly. So for security measures, very often banks would not allow a person to have an interpreter, so a relay interpreter over the phone. Maybe that person had lost their password or needed to do some banking services, and so had gotten themselves a relay interpreter from the appropriate measures and been told, no, it's not safe to have this. I'm not doing it over the phone with you this way by the bank. And this had happened many, many times to people. And it was interesting to see that the experiences were almost exactly the same, even in different countries, what people had experienced. So briefly, some data. So this is Fiona talking about ringing emergency services when she was sick and not being able to hear what was being said on the phone. Vivian here, if it wasn't so tragic, it would be funny that this person, she had a hospital appointment and the hospital had booked her a relay interpreting and said, we're going to do phone interpreting. So you call us, the interpreter will call us too, and then you call the interpreter, and then we relay the interpretation over the phone. And Vivian kept saying, no, 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 I want an in-person BSL interpreter. And they kept saying, no, we're not doing that. And it was, farcical because Vivian was getting a lung capacity test to see, her lung function. So she was going to have to be breathing at the interpreter, who then has to repeat that back to the person over the phone, like ridiculous measures we have here. And that's what she had to kind of fight for. It's something like insane when you think about the purpose of the appointment. And then Oliver here talked about, the frustrating part with mental health services, for example, is that very often the hearing person is told, call. In Ireland, we have, I know there are various phone-based services where you can talk to somebody, and in the UK, the same, where you pick up the phone and you call somebody and you talk to them and they cancel you, and that's not a possibility for deaf people. And disappointment, excuse me, was across all three jurisdictions. So people were disappointed in the laws. They thought the law was going to be one thing, and then it turned out not to be the case, or they were confused about the law, or they saw confusion in their community about what the law might be. And there was a disappointment with the lack of rights. And people I have a section on it here because it was so prolific. So many people talked about it. So many people referred to these laws as like just words on a page or pretty words on a page. And this was across all three jurisdictions. And I thought it was really interesting that that was the kind of common narrative that people talked about the law. And I'm going to show you some now. So Dara here was disappointed that there was no specific uh, recognition of like needs of deaf children, again, getting back to education. Charles talked about not having individual rights. You know, you didn't have individual rights. And calling it an official language doesn't really do anything. And you had then talked about, you know, the Sign Language Act had minimal effects. It didn't really do anything. And, you know, deaf people are seen more as a disability group even after the passing of the act. So this is the thing on pretty words on a page. So I have, as I said, from all across every jurisdiction. So Paul talked about, you know, it looked like it was just a piece of paper with words on it. Miko said kind of the same thing. Sign language laws are like pretty words on paper. They get passed, but they don't change anything. Megan said the same. You know, if you look at the law now, we can say that there's a British Sign Language Act, but that's just on paper. And Tina sort of said the same. You know, there's no power behind the law. Anna also, there's no sanctions, there's no punishment. You know, with the laws, there are sanctions, not the ISL Act, and it's rather vague. You know, and she's right. I think there isn't that same sanction if you violate the law. There's nothing behind it. It's again pretty words on a page. Okay, so where do we go now? After all of that, where do we go from here? So the purpose of this research was to produce a roadmap for legislation. So like sort of, if I want to do good legislation, what do I do? Now I understand that this is a little blurry. I have zoomed in on it, and it is available in the conference booklet, which some of you might have downloaded. And I am working on a paper right now to actually publish this too. So if you can see at the very top here, I have recommended continuous and consistent input and engagement with the deaf community and deaf people, right? You need to be asking deaf people first, what do you need? And you need to ask them in an accessible way, whether that's, you know, Facebook groups where they can submit videos like they did in Scotland, or whether that's going around the country and doing various like town hall events at, say, deaf clubs or deaf organizations and saying, this is what we're thinking of doing for the Act. What do you guys need? And collecting that data and actually valuing that response. Because I think it's one thing to sort of say we're listening and not actually listen, and to have decided what you're going to put in the Act beforehand, but actually to take that information from people and to listen to them and listen to their experiences and to put that together into a law is a very different thing. So then only when you have that input should you be asking yourself, what do you want from the law? Because then you're actually being led by deaf people. So I have here equality for deaf people, status for a specific sign language, or improved employment outcomes. And all of those, I think, feed into education, improved education access and outcomes. And then at the very bottom, you need to have clear and complete communication with deaf people about what the law actually entails. So it's really important that when you're finished with your act, you need to communicate this clearly to deaf people, what the parameters of this law are, because, you know, at the time of the passing of some of these laws, you saw so many politicians saying things that sometimes I thought, these politicians maybe don't even know what this law is about, and saying that it's going to be a dawn of new rights for deaf people, and it categorically wasn't. It couldn't have been. And I think it's very exciting for people, and people kind of maybe get carried away sometimes with the rhetoric, but that's not good enough, because there's people who need to know specifically what this law is going to do for them and how this law is going to impact them. And importantly for activists, how much more they need to do. You know, is this the end of the road for us for deaf rights, or do we still need to fight? And being very clear about what the law will give and what the law won't give to deaf people. So some zoomed in look at some of the stuff here. So improved education outcomes, as I said, this everything feeds into this, I think. I think if you don't have this, the other things are not really feasible. So you need to provide upskill and appropriate training to deaf adults, right? If we only focus on deaf children, we are leaving so many people behind who've missed out on appropriate education, who've missed out on opportunities because the system was not set up to deal with deaf people. So upskilling and appropriate training needs to be there for deaf adults. there are upskill and training opportunities for hearing adults, but we need to make sure that they are provided and accessible for deaf people, in terms of, interpretation or being done in sign language themselves, and in terms of cost. And then there needs to be access to high quality sign language education for deaf children across the board. That needs to be regional. So it can't just be that there's only that accessibility in the capital, because then you're back to a postcode lottery. There needs to be investment into pathways for employment for deaf people, meaningful access to third level education with consistent accessibility aids, and access to high quality sign language education for parents and of deaf children. To be fair, I think that's very straightforward, and I don't think anyone here and anyone with an experience with the deaf community would necessarily agree with that, would disagree with that. Maybe they would, but I think it's pretty straightforward. So these are the other sort of supplementary things that all feed into education. Equality for deaf people, so increased investment into services, including, interpreting services, monitoring and regulating of that service. Investment into accessibility services, so the closed captions, interpretation of public events, sort of decrease the amount of phone-based services, or an alternative at least to the phone-based services. And again, access to high quality sign language education. There needs to be, for improved employment outcomes, the upskilling again, this needs to be here. Deaf awareness training in state bodies, workplaces, and an incentivized deaf awareness training for private entities, and that's really important. Increase sign language education for hearing people, and access to quality sign language education for deaf people, right? If deaf people want, if they were to provide spaces for deaf people to work in these environments, deaf people need to have the qualifications and the opportunity to do that, and that's through education. And then status, so, meaningful and consistent engagement with public bodies needs to be accessible. The increased availability of sign language interpreting on TV, introduction of a formal professional register for sign language teachers, which was a big issue that came up, and access to high quality sign language education. If you're interpreting, parliamentary events, and a majority of your deaf people do not have access to a language because of the poor education they received, who are you interpreting it for? People need to be, have access to education so that the provision of this status can be of benefit to deaf people. So deaf people can be involved in this creation of laws. So deaf people can become MPs. So deaf people can attain higher highs in their career and in their communities. So just briefly on the involvement. So there's no, in Ireland, Finland, or the UK, there's no deaf MPs, or TDs as we call them in Ireland, who are lawmakers. There needs to be consistent, accessible engagement and involvement, because this helps people to understand so it helps politicians to understand what's needed, and it helps deaf people to manage their expectations. And you don't have this thing where I thought that it was going to change, my life. I thought I was going to have new rights. Well, no, not really. And it helps educate the community about their rights. And that's but people really, really need to be clear on what their rights are. And this is just from Cahill here, there's no involvement of the community, and he really wanted more of that. A lot on education here, but as I said, quality teaching, education should be grounded in law. There needs to be a right to this. Megan talked about that there at the very top. So Megan says deaf people should have the right to bilingual education. Paul also said the same, that you needed to have accessible education, full access to education for children. Tina specifically talked about early access to sign language education, and that came up quite a bit, that sometimes it's too late when you get to primary school, and these children need to have access to sign language from birth, essentially. She talked about in Finland there was no deaf daycares, right? There's no daycares for deaf students. So what do you do when a child is growing up in a signing environment? A deaf child is growing up in that environment, and then they have to go to daycare where they're the only deaf child. What do you do then? And then Killian talked about, that they're wanting it to be on par with the Irish language education in Ireland, so that we should be deaf schools in every corner of Ireland in the same way that there are Irish language schools all across Ireland. So again, rights, participants wanted the same protections as other minority language groups. So we can see Welsh in Wales, We can see Irish in Ireland. We can see Swedish in Finland. And people wanted those same rights. And those rights need to be met with adequate services. That's so important. And we see that with the voucher scheme in Ireland, that when the voucher scheme was brought in, it was an immediate drain on the availability of interpreters because there's not enough interpreters to meet demand. I said that earlier, there needs to be, if you provide for a right and a service based on that right, that service better be funded and better be supported by sufficient funds and sufficient resources. So rights are meaningful and achievable. If I have to fill in 12 forms in order to get access to a service, is it achievable? Is it meaningful? And without, as I said, without access to education, can people meaningfully use these rights? And then status for sign language. This is pretty common that the laws try to do, like to provide status. Was something that I think all the laws had talked about. And Collier talked about something really interesting. They need to prepare themselves, the politicians and the government needs to prepare themselves for the possibility of a deaf person getting involved in politics. What happens then when a deaf person gets involved in politics? Are they prepared? Are the systems ready for it? And I don't think they are. But as I said, education really needs to underpin this. Access to work, again, deaf people are service providers, not just service users. This is so crucial, I think, that very often the laws look at deaf people as service users, but they never think of a deaf person as service providers, right? They think of the deaf person going to the job center or the unemployment office and trying to find a job, but they don't think of the deaf person working in the unemployment office and just meeting people, right? They're not thinking of it in that way. And I think that's really illuminating on how, hearing people who are constructing these laws see deaf people and see their potential. But also, like, practically, like, deaf people, if the role of this or the goal of this act is to improve access to employment, well, you're going to have deaf employed people. You better have services to support that. So, Gráinne talked about that. It doesn't actually cover deaf people who work in public services. And again, education is key. So Peter here talked about, deaf people need to have a good education, first of all, to be capable of working in these jobs I'm talking about. Okay, that's everything for today. Thank you so much. I really appreciate everyone's time. I really appreciate everyone who attended this conference. And yeah, I'm gonna leave it there now. And please feel free to get in touch if you have any questions or want some of the content for this. So yeah, thank you.